Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time English program explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. And I'm Natalia Humenyuk, and that's what we have prepared for you tonight. We sit down for a rare exclusive interview with National Security and Defense Council Secretary Oleksandr Turchynov on Ukraine's new occupied territories law. Will Ukraine receive the next tranche of International Monetary Fund aid? We talked with the organization's resident representative to find out about the issues at play. What if the accepted wisdom of rescuing Ukraine's economy is wrong? Balazs Jarabik presents an alternative vision for promoting economic growth. In the fourth year of the war, how are Ukrainians from frontline towns restarting their lives? Our correspondent traveled to the region to find out. Oleksandr Turchinov, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, is one of the most important figures in Ukrainian politics. And if we speak about fighting the war with Russia, he is the second most important after the president. He runs the second largest faction in the parliament, Narodny Front, and as well, his political force is the second most important in the country. Today, he is considered to be a political hardliner on issues related to the conflict in Donbass and the war in Crimea. In fact, Turchinov served as acting president of Ukraine right after the Euromaidan revolution, as well as the moment of the Crimea annexation and the start of the war with Russia. He rarely gives interview and seldom to the foreign media. In this exclusive talk, my colleagues sat with him and talked about the war, the new law on the occupied territories, his attitude towards the peace process and the tensions between freedom and providing security. We also asked about the future of the presidential elections, his ambitions and his relations with the current President Poroshenko, on which political life in Ukraine depends.
My first question is about the Donbass law. The lawmakers had voted in its favor. The bill is now on the president's desk to be signed. Our question is, you are the main ideologist behind this bill, so how is it going to be implemented? Can you tell us a bit more?
First off, Russia is now officially recognized as an aggressor country, and this wrecks Putin's plans to mask his aggressive military operation under a peacekeeping one. Secondly, the law clearly determines the technique for protecting those Ukrainian citizens who were forced to stay on the occupied territories and those who had to leave their homes that are in Ukraine now. They lost their property, estates, and so on. The law clearly states that any actions that are carried out in the occupied Donbass will not be legally recognized. While it holds diplomatic methods as the top priority, the law also provides the opportunity for Ukraine to use force, armed forces, and other power institutions to their full potential in order to defend the country, fight back against aggression, and restore the country's sovereignty in the occupied territories.
Do we understand correctly that the philosophy of the Donbass law allows the use of force in order to restore the occupied territories?
We're not saying that the only way to do it is by force, by the use of the armed forces, but this law does not rule out this method and creates the right conditions for that, so that no additional legislative acts are required to be taken and there is a legal foundation for the use of force and resisting the aggressor already. At the same time, the law also does not rule out the diplomatic method. Quite the opposite. No one canceled the Minsk agreements. Yes, Russia is trying to sabotage them, Russia is trying to neutralize them, but at the same time, the president deems the diplomatic method as one of his most preferred ones today.
You spoke of the people who stayed in the occupied territories, that the law provides them with legal status and the territories are seen as temporarily occupied. How would you, as the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, refer to the people who stayed at the temporary occupied territories?
Many people were just forced to stay, and of course, among them, there are those who cooperate with the occupant administrations. Because the LPR and the DPR are fake titles to cover up for the military occupant administrations installed by Russia on the occupied territory. And of course, there are those who cooperate, and even more, those who took part in riots against their own country, took part in military or criminal activities. There are many of those, but there are also those who don't have any other option, who stay in their houses and have to work in some establishments.
Last year, a whole array of measures to resist Russia's hybrid war actions came into force. We remember there was a ban on Russian social media and a change in the rules for crossing the border, as well as an expansion of the economic sanctions and many other things. Were there any results of these measures? How can one sense a result under hybrid war conditions?
Friends, if those results didn't exist, we wouldn't have an independent European Ukraine. So the fact that it exists is a proof of our joint victory, and it's a proof that Putin can't meet the goals he set and wanted to meet in the beginning of 2014. There is no such thing as a free, independent, and European Ukraine in Russia's format of imperial revanche.
But do you not think that these methods resemble the methods of Putin's Russia?
Which ones?
When we speak of certain restrictions, bans, isn't it like fighting Russia using their own methods? You probably saw how serious the discussions were in the society when you banned social media websites like Vkontakte, Odnoklassniki, and other websites.
When there is a hybrid war and no methods to resist it, the country becomes unprotected. And I, as NSDC secretary who initiated many sanctions, restrictions, including the ban on Russian social media and other information resources used not only as information tools, but also as an aggressive cyber tool against our country, I think that it's our duty. How did Russia play the game? It turned the freedoms of both European and non-European countries like the United States and others into their weaknesses. When the West pushed for the importance of not putting any restrictions on the media and the information they provide, it turned some media into a weapon. We can see it with Crimea. First there is Russian media, and then there are Russian tanks.
Mr. Turchinov, since you raised this topic, do you agree that freedom can be restricted for the sake of security under the condition of a hybrid war?
The line is based on our Constitution. There is a law that allows limiting some serious things if there is incoming military aggression.
How long will we need to restore the control over the occupied territories without considering the Russian factor? How long do we need to wait? We've developed our army, we see some progress. So how long?
A lot depends on our strategic partners. Unfortunately, there are many new politicians coming into European governments who say that it's Ukraine's problem without realizing that Ukraine is Europe's outpost and that the Ukrainians don't just defend Ukrainian independence, but Europe too. We stopped the progress of Russia's aggression toward the West, so it's quite an irresponsible attitude from them. We really needed their help back then, and I didn't receive a single cartridge.
But why is this happening? Do global leaders even think of Ukraine as a subject, or are we still just an object in their eyes?
Unfortunately, it's a problem. Ukraine is treated as a problem. Like, you see, we lose our own profits because of Ukraine, because of the sanctions. Have you noticed how often the question of canceling Russian sanctions is raised now in various European countries? You see, they don't sense this. Their matters are more important to them than someone else's. There is no understanding that it's not just about Ukraine as a European state, but about a civilizational choice and the future of Europe. And what's our problem? We don't learn from history. History teaches us that it doesn't teach us anything. Unfortunately, that's how it is. For example, there were the Munich agreements when Hitler received part of Czechia to calm him down. They didn't want to irritate the aggressor. And then they spilled their blood all over European land. So I find this formula, don't irritate the aggressor, deceptive and dangerous. Russia makes claims to its imperial rights, to its rights to other countries' territories. They even do it demonstratively now. And this doesn't just concern Ukraine.
Do I understand correctly that you're not planning to take part in any form in the 2019 presidential elections?
I worked as president and I didn't like it. No sleep, tremendous workload. Therefore, I am not planning to run for president or to head any political party.
Describe your relationship with the president, taking into account the history of your difficult political relations, coming back to the year of 2005. How did you manage to reconcile, and in what state is your relationship right now?
One needs to make conclusions from feuds and from their own political experience. I made my own, and I think so did Poroshenko. I am in charge of defense matters, so I view the president as the supreme commander. That's how I see him when I follow his commands and orders.
So not partners, friends, or allies?
I don't throw out labels such as friend, it's not in my nature, but I do think that we work in the same direction and solve the same problems, which concern security and defense. The Supreme Commander gives out orders and I obey them. That's a normal relationship, and of course, I think that there are mistakes made, there are problems, but our relationship allows me to make a point when I agree or disagree with a certain decision. But once this decision is approved and the decree is signed, we have to obey. But I want to say that the President often takes my advice into account. At the same time, his experience is crucial for making the right decisions.
And for the full version of the interview, keep your eye on our website this Monday. The address is en.hromadske.ua. Also sign up for our brand new newsletter if you would like to receive Hromadske International weekly highlights. The sign up box on the upper right hand side of the site. As well, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International, and I'll be back in a second. Next week, a small team from Washington office of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, will arrive in Ukraine to discuss the country's reform efforts. Their revelation of Kyiv's progress will influence whether Ukraine receives the next tranche of aid from the organization. My colleague Angelina Karyakina sat down with the IMF Resident Representative in Ukraine, Goesta Ljungman, to get his evaluation of Ukraine's plans for an anti-corruption court, its willingness to adjust gas prices, and the touchy issues of land reform, all conditions for IMF aid.
So the key conditions for the next review is legislation establishing an independent anti-corruption court. It is adjustment of domestic gas tariffs in line with import prices. It is also to ensure that fiscal policy is consistent with program commitments. And then also a privatization law that will support open, market-based, transparent sale of government companies. And a final key condition for the next review is pension reform that ensures that the pension system is fair and that it is sustainable.
Mm-hmm. How much progress have you seen on those conditions that you were just naming in the past few months, I would say?
We've been discussing these reforms, and we continue to discuss them. We haven't completed those discussions yet.
And how possible do you think is receiving by Ukraine the rest of the sum in the framework of the whole program by the end of 2019?
So it's very much feasible for Ukraine to complete these reviews, and when those reviews are completed, then it's possible to disperse the next tranche under the program.
Because we've heard different assessments from the Minister of Finances and also from the National Bank saying that if Ukraine doesn't receive the tranche by July, it's almost obvious that it's hard to get the whole program done by the end of 2019. How would you comment on that?
So I think that the important thing now is to focus on the next review. So it's important to focus on the reforms that is going to unlock this review, and also to focus on the overall economic policies that will ensure that the stability seen now in Ukraine following the crisis in 2014 and 15 can be preserved, that growth can accelerate, and that this growth can be sustained in the medium term.
Okay, let's get to that discussion then. The anti-corruption court. The latest letter from the IMF states that in the current form, the fund wouldn't be able to support the draft law, the president's draft law. The letter from the World Bank says that there could be some adjustments to the already existing draft law. What would you say, does Ukraine really need to create a new one and then to work on a new draft law, or this one could be adjusted in some form, in conforming the recommendations from the Venice Commissions and so on?
So let's first start with what is the crucial thing here, and that is that an independent corruption court is established, and that this court is staffed with independent judges that have impeccable integrity, and that this court is set up without any delay. Regarding the legislation, there is broad consensus that the draft legislation does not ensure this outcome. It does not meet the requirements under the IMF program and is not consistent with the Venice Commission recommendation. So what's really what's needed now is to take a step back and ensure really that the draft legislation is strengthened so that the fight against high-level corruption can be successful.
What crucial means and what binding means. It's sort of a strong word, and it's pretty much understandable that the council should have a quota in deciding on candidates. But there is another discussion also that creating this public council of international experts and giving them sort of power of veto of candidates questions Ukrainian sovereignty or even constitution. How would you comment on that? Do you agree with that?
The key issue here is to ensure that those who apply to be a judge on the anti-corruption court are that their application is verified to ensure that they have the right qualifications and that they have the strong integrity. Screening these candidates and doing that by an independent and trusted body is really in Ukraine's interest. It's going to help strengthen the rule of law and help in the fight against corruption.
Why exactly international experts?
I think again the important thing here is to ensure that there is the selection process for judges gets the right support, and that it gets the support from an independent body and a body that is widely trusted.
Going to the other condition, guest prices. We have seen that the Ukrainian government is not so eager to take those steps quickly. But there is a certain time frame, and my question is how flexible is this adjustment, and how far, how much progress is there in discussions on the formula?
So there is an agreement under the IMF-supported program that domestic gas prices should be adjusted in line with the development of import prices for gas. And it's important that that agreement is honored. It's necessary to encourage an efficient use of gas. It's also important to provide incentives for investing in gas exploration and gas production. But it's also important to adjust gas prices so that to close the possibility for someone to illegally purchase gas at a below market cost and then sell that gas at a markup to industries and pocket the difference. But it's equally important that poor and vulnerable households are protected from sharp increases in the gas price. And the existing household utility subsidy program plays exactly that role. And it currently covers more than half of the Ukrainian households.
We have been hearing that land reform is one of the crucial conditions for a long time. Why is it off table now?
We hope is that the government will finalize the legislation on the land reform that's currently under development with the support of the World Bank, and that this draft legislation will be submitted to Parliament for discussion. Land market reform is important in Ukraine to increase investments and increase the productivity in the agricultural sector. Land reform is going to enable Ukrainian agricultural land to be able to be used as a collateral when taking out bank loans. And then these bank loans can be used to invest in machinery, to install irrigation, to purchase seed and fertilizer. It is a key element of the program, and
it still is.
It
still is. We know that this year and the coming year is Ukraine will have to pay some record sums on national debt, and it means that Ukraine will probably have to turn for more foreign loans. How do you assess risks of financial meltdown, and does the IMF consider those risks in terms of cooperation with Ukraine in the framework with the program?
The IMF program also ensures that Ukraine has sufficient foreign currency reserves to service its external debt. So what's important now is that these policies and the reforms are being continued so that the economy can strengthen further.
If Ukraine doesn't get the next tranche, what happens to Ukrainian economy?
I don't want to speculate about that.
If we assess the program by now, but at this point, how much Ukraine has done under this program, and if you can measure it in percentage, in some percentage, and how much needs to be done more?
Yeah. So a lot of important reforms have taken place since 2014. The ones that I can highlight is the strengthening of the monetary policy regime, the modernization of financial policies. It's the energy sector reforms, so adjustment of domestic gas prices, and also the strengthening of the corporate governance in Naftogaz. And it's also setting up important anti-corruption institutions such as NABU and putting in place electronic asset declarations.
What are still the weakest points in Ukrainian economy? What should be a subject of main attention in Ukraine?
So growth in Ukraine has returned after the output contraction in 2014 and 15. Growth needs to accelerate, and growth also needs to be sustainable. And for this to happen, investment is needed. And when you ask investors what prevents them from placing their money in the Ukrainian economy, the answer that you get is very often a concern about property rights, the rule of law, and corruption.
The international buzzwords for rescuing Ukraine's economy are well known: reforms, austerity, foreign direct investment, FDI. But what if that international consensus is wrong and austerity actually prevents Ukraine from receiving foreign direct investment? We are joined by Balazs Jarabik, non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and excellent expert on Eastern Europe, Central Europe and Ukraine. So, Balazs, we just watched this interview with the representative of IMF in Ukraine, but in a broad, speaking broadly, should we consider any alternative approach to reinvigorating Ukrainian economies?
Well, thanks for having me, Natalka. Always very good to be here. And this is a very, not just interesting, but a heavy topic. First of all, because I'm not an economist, I'm more researching this or viewing this from transition research. You know, I'm from Central Europe myself and dealing with Ukraine the past 15 years. I think one of the things is what we see, the conflict between the Western institutions and Ukraine can be summarized very simple. The Western institutions trying to do sometimes quite dogmatic policy prescriptions, as we heard. At the same time, the Ukrainian government wants to be re-elected. And the word elections we haven't heard in the interview, for example, which is the actual political situation in Ukraine. Now, that's being said, the second thing is that we have been seeing grow, but we have been seeing very modest growth, particularly toward the recession, which was 15% in 2014. And I'm among those scholars who are thinking that the actual prescription was a bit too dogmatic and was not tied to the Ukrainian actual political situation. The prescription was austerity, macroeconomic stability, which is terribly important for Ukraine. At the same time, was also calculating with increased FDI, foreign direct investment, which was not actually happening. Now, what is the problem with the austerity is not only making sure that there is macroeconomic stability, but also reduced very heavily, according to state statistics, the state investment. Now, investment are coming from the banks, coming from the state, and coming from the FDI. And if there is no FDI and the banking sector is still very weak and fragile, it is the role of the state which should be forthcoming, and that's exactly what the Western policy prescriptions killed.
So where will the state will take money then, especially when we're speaking about getting the foreign direct investment into Ukraine? Of course, we heard that, of course, the rule of law is the issue, but of course, and as well, the war is an issue, and
right.
That's how it's seen.
Yes, and here I agree with the IMF otherwise neat assessment that, unfortunately, the institutions, the rule of law, the corruption, the still ongoing corruption, these are serious obstacles towards state investment as well. But again, the Western policy prescriptions were also a heavy obstacle. And one of the crucial things is that the IMF, this is the 7th IMF program vis-a-vis Ukraine in the past 20 years. Now 6 has been failed. And, we can blame Ukraine a lot for that, but I think if there is 6 programs, the actual lessons learned from why these 6 programs have failed should be taken into account. And what the IMF is now saying, and the Western institutions are saying, rule of law, corruption, and all this, it is not something new, and we should know that it takes time. So what is the alternative? And here comes, I think it should be the state and the austerity for particularly. And let's name it as it is. Austerity is a concept which have been a failure in the European Union as well. And provided, it's a German concept and was forced to the EU, and now there is quite open economic and even star economists are saying that this has been a mistake, which was actually limited growth within the European Union. So the question is whether we are trying to convince Ukraine about something which already failed in the European Union.
Another advice is, of course, a large privatization, which little by little takes place, though a number of very important assets, state assets, are not still privatized. At the same time, some of them, some industries or some spheres, like if we speak about energy, I'm not speaking about the oil and gas, but for instance, electricity, they're already privatized.
Exactly. Like Carnegie just published an energy reform review when one of the theses is that, our experts were not sure that privatization, for example, for the energy, particularly the power generation, is a policy solution at all, since most of it was already in the private hands, and unfortunately, is a monopoly, or DTEC, Rinat Akhmetov DTEC is in a very heavily monopolistic solution. So that is what I'm trying to say, that in many ways we're trying to ascribe or prescribe a dogmatic or general policy prescription into a very local situation, and we should be a little bit more flexible, which by the way, I think the IMF and the Western institutions, by the way, trying to do.
And how the situation is unique for Ukraine compared to its eastern neighbors, also who went through the reforms. Sometimes these reforms are compared. Sometimes we can even discuss if it's eligible to compare the reforms of early 90s, before the crisis, with different EU, with non-oligarchic economy yet, with what's going on in Ukraine. And you have the strong knowledge of the region.
I think what we're trying to compare the situation, we shouldn't compare really to the 90s, because Ukraine already going through the 90s, which was similar to Russia, very wild privatization, the oligarchization of the society and politics, and Ukraine. This is still one of the key weaknesses. What Ukraine doesn't have vis-a-vis, for example, Russia is a very pluralistic, still democratic society, as well as there is a huge competition, which ensures, among political parties, which ensure competition. I think we can compare Ukraine vis-a-vis Central and Eastern European neighbors, which are meaning the Western neighbors of Ukraine, which are much more, because this is exactly where the countries where the heavy FDI came in after the shock therapy, when it comes to Slovakia, when it comes to Hungary, when it comes to Poland or the Czech Republic. What we see there, though, there is a backlash against the foreign direct investment, particularly because the convergence with the Western Europe, with the Western Europe part of the European Union has stopped in 2008, after 2008 and 2009, particularly when it comes to the wages. For example, the Czechs or the Slovaks have 1/3 of the German wages. And, the Czechs and the Slovaks are not comparing that to Ukraine. They're comparing it to Germany. So there is a feeling, and this is what explains, the regressive politics of Viktor Orbán in Hungary, or, for example, Kaczynski in PiS, which is turning against Western Europe a little bit, which are saying, the economic solutions which you guys were preaching us were not really working for everyone in the society. So that is the East-West divide which we are seeing there.
We can say that economy is about figures, but it's so much about feelings as well. And another notions which always pumps up, of course, in case of Ukraine, but today globally, and of course in Eastern Europe, it's anti-corruption fight. We discussed with you earlier that according to the recent Eurobarometer corruption survey, nearly 8 in 10 Europeans agree that there are two close links between business and politics in their country. So this is a pretty high percentage for the whole continent. At the same time, I would be very concerned that anti-corruption fight is becoming politicized, though speaking about this, it's also a slippery slope, because that's how the corruption apologists treating that issue. So we hear these notions from the Western allies, not just, and also anti-corruption activists and political forces here in Ukraine. How would you really think we should treat that? Also bearing in mind the experience of our neighbors.
Yeah, first of all, I think when it comes to the corruption, and I think even the Western institutions would agree with that the corruption has been, the situation around corruption has been improving. Not only because of the anti-corruption institutions, which are very important, but first of all, you're seeing the actual corruption experience going down. I can fully confirm, I used to live here for long years. I was exposed to corruption, in various institutions, Ukrainian institutions, which is no longer exist. The police, the hospitals, the border guards, these are, so the actual situation has been improving, and you're saying that the corruption experience of Ukrainian people is going down. What is not moving is the perception. The perception is extremely high, but it's very interestingly very similar to Central Europe. Like the actual corruption experience in Central Europe is now, for example, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, is around 6-7%. Right? In Ukraine, it's higher, it's around 20-25%. But it's going down already, decreasing tendency. Now, in Slovakia or the Czech Republic, the actual corruption perception is over 90%. How you can explain this huge difference, right? And one of the explanation is that, exactly as you're saying, that the corruption, the anti-corruption, is over-politicized because, A, the Western institutions or the European institutions are putting a lot of emphasis that, and B, because really the national elites are remaining corrupt in these countries as well. So this is a relevant issue. But at the same time, there is also a growing gap between the elites and the rest of the people. So the politics is where the actual corruption is happening in Central and Eastern Europe, including, for example, Ukraine. At the same time, the actual corruption experience by the institutional level because of the anti-corruption is going down. Now, the other factor which I think is important is conflating between corruption and competence. And when you're digging yourself into the surveys, then you're seeing when people are listing, right, the actual reason for corruption, then it comes to the competence of the authorities, and it comes to actually the figure which is astonishing, that people see business and government relations to close, which is the #1 reason of the corruption. So across the European Union, not only in Ukraine, people see state capture at the highest level.
At the same time, in particular in Eastern Europe, we have the birth of the anti-corruption institution. We have them in some of the Baltic states. We had a very interesting case in Romania where, it had taken them years to build the anti-corruption bodies, and they had become successful, yet politicized as well, but sometimes some people would bring it as an example for Ukraine. So what are your concerns about that? And also, there is a huge hope on the anti-corruption bodies here, as probably not because they're named like that, but in particular because they are brand new institutions which are created from the scratch compared to the institutions we have inherited, where people really don't believe it's possible to get rid of this something which had been there for decades. So how do you assess this thing in Ukraine, but also in other countries?
And
you don't have these institutions in the older Western European states.
Exactly. We have in Slovakia, for example, and I used to use this example that, it took almost 15 years for the so-called special court, which was set up for corruption in Slovakia, to actually put in jail the first high level, at the ministerial level.
15 years.
15 years. So I think, but it's very important that the institutions itself, and the IMF representative was talking about integrity, it is bringing the necessary accountability, integrity, a check and balances, separation of powers into the heavily top-down Ukrainian governance system. So I think it's terribly important. At the same time, particularly the experience of Central Europe, and there is a huge scandal in Romania by now that the anti-corruption authorities, which are very independent, right, that independent, they're putting one politician after another into jail, probably for a good reason, but now the entire political class is thinking, and not only in Romania, but in Central and Eastern Europe, that maybe, who these institutions are accountable to the European Union, or where? Because they're not accountable to anyone they're not elected, right? So the democratic mandate of these institutions actually coming into the limelight, which is a very interesting, it's a kind of backlash of the political class, which has to go through democratic elections, investing into this, and they're seeing emerging institutions which are, suddenly coming. They're very strong. They have even sometimes public support, but they never elected. So the question of democratic legitimacy came into the time, and the actual Romanian anti-corruption scandal is connected to the accusations, and so far these accusations seems to be confirmed, that the anti-corruption agencies, because of under the urgency of delivering results, were secretly cooperating with the secret services to put pressure on the those who they wanted to convict. So the issue is how much they, again, the objectives are eating the intentions are eating the objective in this particular case.
I should say Ukrainians are very curious about that and looking into those details also not to make the same mistakes. And Balazs, thanks so much for an interesting conversation. And that was Balazs Jarabik, who is the non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I'll be back in a second. The war in eastern Ukraine may be fading from the headlines, but fighting continues, and some 3 million people remain in need of humanitarian assistance in Donbass. From reconstructing homes to providing food, aid, humanitarian assistance, that's what is helping frontline residents rebuild their life. But humanitarian agencies are also facing their own struggle with funding. So my colleague Natalie Vihro, who will join us right after the report, traveled to Luhansk region to see how humanitarian aid is helping residents near the front line and what problem persists for local communities.
It's called Ukraine's frozen conflict. But as we drive through the frontline towns in the government-controlled territory of the Luhansk region, it's clear that snow and ice aside, there is little that is frozen about the situation in the eastern Donbass. Some 400 civilians have been killed or injured in the war between Ukraine and the Russian-backed separatists in 2017 alone. And around 3 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance as aid agencies themselves struggle with funding. Hromadske travelled with the International Committee of the Red Cross to examine the humanitarian situation in the Luhansk region, where foreign aid is helping bring a semblance of normalcy back to people's lives. For Natalia Simonenko and her family, that aid was critical. Assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross allowed them to return home. The family fled when the conflict reached Stanitsa Luhanska in 2014 and decided to wait out the heavy fighting in Russia. A year later, they were about to board the train home when they received a call from their neighbours with the news. Their house had been destroyed by fire from the shelling.
We saw what currently outside and here rubbish. Everything was in ruins, everything had burned down.
Все замечательно.
Last year, the International Committee of the Red Cross built a brand new house for the Simonenko family and helped them purchase new furniture as part of their reconstruction program. And despite the occasional sound of gunfire, Natalia is happy to be home.
I'm home. At home, even the walls help. It's good to be home. Here, the neighbors are also building. They are going to be coming back.
More than 13,500 people lived here before the war started. When fighting broke out in Stanitsa Luhanska in 2014, many people like the Simonenkos fled the city. They included doctors, nurses, and medical specialists from the Stanitsa Luhanska Central District Hospital.
We absolutely don't have a dermatologist, ear, nose, and throat doctor, transfusiologist, tuberculosis specialist, or radiologist. We would take new ones with pleasure, but there's no one. One gynecologist came, so we have 2 gynecologists now. One of them is sick at the moment, but at least we have 2. And we got an anesthetist, not for permanent work. He works under an individual schedule, but for at least half a month he works. When he's not here, military anesthetists help us out. It's a tradition since 2015. We help each other. We help the military helps us.
With the government providing little incentive for doctors and nurses to come and work in frontline towns like Stanitsa Luhanska, attracting new recruits is nearly impossible.
Officially or unofficially, there's a ban on paying more than time and a half. How can we attract employees with higher salaries? Everyone knows that Stanitsa is where the war is, and no one is coming here. There might have been volunteers who would come here for the higher salaries, but we don't have that here. Working in the Kyiv region and in Stanitsa is the same.
Globally, for many people, the situation is becoming more difficult because, the conflict has been ongoing for more than 3 years. Now we are in the 4th year, and many are arriving, I would say, to the limit of the capacity to cope with it. So there were some survey showing that concerning, for example, food security, the situation is more difficult. On our side, I would say that we concentrated for the last 4 years in areas near the contact line, where yes, there are still a lot of needs.
But despite the overwhelming needs of frontline towns, Ukraine is only getting a fraction of the attention and funding it requires, as emergencies like the European migration crisis and the war in Yemen present new challenges for aid groups and overshadow Donbass in the headlines. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Aid in Ukraine, their 2017 humanitarian response plan received only 34% of the funding it needed. And the UN World Food Programme plans to stop food aid to eastern Ukraine at the end of the month as a result of insufficient funding. Even the Red Cross is struggling to cover its budget in Ukraine.
In 2017, we finished the year with a deficit, meaning that the contribution we directly got for Ukraine did not cover our expenses, and we took from what we call earlier mark funding, which is a bit a paradox, because usually, it's through major operations that you attract your funding. So it's difficult to explain why there is this reduction of contribution for Ukraine. Yes, other contexts are. And the deterioration in many parts of the world are some explanation, but there are also some people thinking that, or some people, governments, I would say, thinking that yes, there is some wealth in Ukraine and that people can cope with the resources which are in the country, I would say.
For the Red Cross, Ukraine sits in its top 10 missions across the world. The agency has set aside 65 million Swiss francs, or $69 million, for 2018, an increase of 10% compared to last year. It will progressively be phasing out its food aid along government-controlled frontline towns in favour of piloting sustainable projects that allow residents to generate their own income through farming and raising livestock. The Red Cross says the decision comes as a result of monitoring the needs of frontline towns, which are now changing. The program currently targets frontline residents who lost their job as a result of the war. For Natalia Bushmakina, it means her family no longer has to rely on the single pension of her husband. Thanks to the program, Natalia now has 81 quails. She can sell their eggs or their meat at the local market.
I already have orders for younglings and eggs, and I have already sold some of the birds for meat. The bird sells for 100-150 hryvnia a kilo. The eggs are 14 hryvnia for 10. I just come out here nearly every day to the market here. We have constant buyers.
Before the war, Natalia worked in a local produce shop near her home in Novatoshkivsk, a village in eastern Ukrainian district of Popasna. After the shooting started, the shop closed down, and then Natalia and her family left themselves. They returned over a year later, but the job prospects in Novatoshkivsk were few.
Yes, 2 families living in one pension. We also have a daughter and a granddaughter. Having our own eggs and meat already makes it easier, and having a little money from sales is good.
For now, business is good, but fighting can still be heard regularly, and with a lack of jobs and people in the town, the family is uncertain about what the future holds.
A future, as you know, is only realistic when there are children, when there are young people. The future is a continuation of something, but when there are funerals every day and the people are leaving the village, that's bad. We want to hope. Our school here is getting some beautiful renovations, and we do have hope.
So Natalie Vihro is with us. Thanks a lot for your job, for the fact you travel and done that story, and bring this feeling. I just would explain where were you. So that's so close to Russia. Stanitsa Luhanska is here, Novotoshkivske and Popasna. These are the small towns. We already, after 4 years, know all these names, but that's really, it's not yet abandoned. But so Natalie, there is a story in the report, but what we felt that there is one of the hugest issues is medical help.
Yes, there is certainly not enough specialists in hospitals near frontline towns. In Stanitsa Luhanska, we saw that in the report. But one of the problems that we didn't get to include in the report is that due to the lack of specialists and the lack of resources, doctors often have to redirect their patients to go to other towns. But some towns are not as close to Stanitsa Luhanska as occupied Luhansk is. So officially, doctors end up sending their patients, doctors refer their patients to clinics in government-controlled territory. But unofficially, because there are some resources that were better developed in places like Luhansk.
Which used to be the regional capital whatsoever compared to this tiny town.
Exactly. So, for example, oncology services are more developed in Luhansk. So unofficially, some patients can receive better care in the occupied regions only because of the resources there that already exist. So unofficially, there is a great need to develop more, to get more specialists and develop more resources on the government side.
At the same time, what we know from there was a lot of effort by the representative of the International Red Cross to explain this unexplainatory situation, why the money are not there. But what we also started to mention that a number of the big donors and institutions, they would like to see more efficient programs, giving some grants, something more systematic, rather than distributing this small aid, for instance, either funds or even like food or clothes or medicine. Is it? And the people they're not complaining about that, but there is still the need of the people. To what extent you have seen that?
Yeah, so we actually spoke to the Red Cross about this, and the way they explain the situation to us is that they do monitor the situation, and it is different in, I guess, in different parts of the Donbass. So, for example, there are still where shooting continues. They do have the more basic. They do have the same needs that they've always had, but then there are towns near the front line, say in the Popasna region, Luhanska, where their needs are developing and they're changing. Local markets are opening up again, and it's giving people a chance to make their own income. So it's giving people a chance to continue to, I guess, rebuild their lives and start making money on their own again, and start building businesses as opposed to just relying on these handouts. There are places, though, they did make it clear, though, that there are places, say in occupied regions, where things like, food aid is still critical. But the key message that they sort of put out is that they are monitoring the situation and they are providing assistance according to the different needs of the different towns.
I think at some time it's becoming not frustrating, just really go to the places where there is a constant need for the humanitarian aid. And the audience and a lot of people further from that region, somewhere in Kyiv or elsewhere, also have developed the fatigue for the same stories for a number of years. I think the people are tired in the regions as well. But what is your kind of, when talking to the people, being in the places, is the feeling? How do people feel there? What is their mood? It could be different, of course.
I think, different people have different moods, I'd say, but there are definitely people who are very happy to be home. They're thankful to be able to return. They understand that there is still conflict going nearby, but for a lot of people, this is still their home, and even if they do hear the occasional fighting, they're happy to start rebuilding their lives. Other people are a bit, they are still hoping for, I guess, like Natalia was saying in the last clip, they are still hoping for younger people to come back. They're hoping for, I guess, other signs of recovery. So in some frontline towns, it's just there's, I guess, little signs of hope, but the situation still isn't quite there. It's still in the stages. I mean, for most towns, it's still in the stages of rebuilding.
Natalie, thanks a lot for sharing the story, sharing your experience with us. That was Natalie Vihro, our colleague who had traveled to Luhansk region. And thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International. We are here to explain Eastern Europe and Ukraine for you. Here you can read the name of our webpage, en.hromadske.ua. Go there. Also, search Hromadske International on Facebook and Twitter. We are there working for you 24/7. Thank you again and goodbye.